6,109 players. That's how many people participated in the Grand Champions Festival hosted by Scraw VGC. This was the largest best of 3 Pokemon tournament ever, and it's not even remotely close at all. The number of matches played in round 1 was double the number of players in the previous largest tournament. That's how much bigger it was. And I was one of those 6,109 players who signed up, hoping to win. Which I didn't. Yeah, I didn't really get close either. Out of all those players, I placed exactly 1,200th with a record of 5 wins and 3 losses. Yeah, I dropped out after I got my 3 losses, but that's only because I told my mom I'd watch Invincible with her, and I didn't feel like playing the extra games if they didn't really mean anything. However, that does not mean I didn't have fun. It was extremely entertaining, and it was actually my first online best of 3 tournament. I also got my friend to play with me, as he was also excited for the chance to play in a tournament for possibly $3,000. The problem was that he just started playing VGC when Champions came out, and didn't know too much, but he was able to make it to Ultra Ball tier in only a couple weeks, which I thought was pretty impressive. He didn't do too well either. Anyways, I'm going to highlight the team I used, and the teams that performed well in the tournament, as well as where I think the metagame will go from here. Enjoy! Starting off with my team, I had a bit of trouble. Early on in the rule set, I was messing around with Mega Gyarados because of all the Basculegion and Mega Charizard Y around. However, even though Gyarados was strong into some popular matchups, it had far more weaknesses. One was Sneasler. Now you might think that it's good on paper because Intimidate was able to better deal with it, and the flying typing made it so that usually Sneasler would either have to click Dire Claw or hope I'd Mega and use Close Combat. However, Sneasler would often be paired with Kingambit, turning Intimidate against me and pinning me with a +1 Kowtow Cleave or Close Combat. I tried to use Volcarona as a support for Mega Gyarados, which wasn't bad, but it didn't really have enough physical bulk. The bigger problem was Mega Floette, which could outspeed and one-shot my Gyarados, and since it had Dazzling Gleam, Volcarona couldn't really protect it much either. So after going on what was probably a losing streak, I don't really know, I'm just remembering that I was losing more than I was winning, which is a bad sign, I decided to shift to something else. And I tried to find a Pokemon that could beat Sneasler, Kingambit, and Floette because I was tired of losing to them. And what I found was Mega Aggron, also commonly known as the Wall. With a high base defense stat and the move Iron Defense, my matchup against Sneasler and Kingambit was very good, as Aggron would barely take any damage from that +2, and can knock out either one of them most of the time with either Heavy Slam or Body Press. Yeah, believe it or not, Heavy Slam Oko's No Bulk Sneasler. It also had a really good matchup against Mega Floette. As a Steel type, it resisted all of Floette's moves, and I was also able to invest all my EVs into HP and Special Defense, making special attacks a lot less effective. A Light of Ruin would only really do around 25% most of the time, whilst Heavy Slam would always 2-shot. However, Mega Aggron also has some weaknesses. The big ones being special attacking fire types like Mega Charizard Y and Mega Delphox. They both resisted my attacks and could deal huge damage in return with Heat Wave. Knowing this, I gave Aggron partners specifically kitted for beating these Pokemon. Aerodactyl, which could outspeed an Oko Charizard and do good damage to Delphox, and Politoed plus Swift Swim Basculegion, which be used to set up rain, minimizing fire damage and one-shotting them in return. I add Sinistcha next, as it is the best support Pokemon for Mega Aggron, healing it with Hospitality and redirecting any ground or fighting type moves with Rage Powder. From here, I need a Pokemon who can deal with Dragon types who match up good in terrain, and Ghost types which Aggron has trouble dealing damage to. And what I find is Weavile. Weavile is the original form of Sneasler, or I guess you could say not the original because it's the modern version of Sneasler. And Sneasler is the #1 Pokemon in the format, whilst Weavile is barely being used. However, it's just what I need right now. Ice Dark typing gives it a great matchup into many of my weaknesses, and it also has a speed stat of 125, which is actually faster than Sneasler, meaning I can use Fake Out before it. The only problem is the item. I already have Focus Sash on Aerodactyl, and I don't really see another item to use on Weavile. Eventually, I settle on White Herb, While Weavile doesn't have Unburden like its distant cousin, it does have Pickpocket, meaning it could steal opposing Pokemon's items under the right conditions. To be honest, it was either this or Pressure, which basically doesn't do anything. Also, just being able to cancel out an attack or speed drop was nice. And with that, I had my team for the Grand Champions Festival. It certainly wasn't perfect, shown by my results, but it also had its strengths and was very fun to play as well. Here's the rental code if you want to try it out. Playing in the festival, I found my main weaknesses, and funny enough, both the Pokemon I'm weak to are very annoying. And I'm not just saying that because they beat me, I just think that the way that they're played is annoying. And those being Sinistra and Mega Scovillain. The thing with Sinistra was that it was always paired with Kingambit, and the main way I would get rid of Kingambit is with Body Press from Mega Aggron. However, Sinistra's Rage Powder prevented me from doing that, meaning I had to settle for Heavy Slam. But then, Sinistra would just Strength Sap me until my Heavy Slam was a Heavy Squish. I don't know, that's the only thing I could think of to replace Slam. The ways I deal with Sinistra are with Aerodactyl's Dual Wing Beat and with Basculegion. Sucker Punch would always just knock out Basculegion, and Dual Wing Beat barely did more than a Heavy Slam, making it kind of just as ineffective. I could use Weavile, but at that point my opponent had so many ways to counter it, as Kingambit could also just OHKO it with either an Iron Head or Low Kick, as Sinistra switched out or protected. Scovillain, fitting its name, was also very annoying. Spicy Spray absolutely destroyed my team, as I had 4 physical attackers, and it could just keep out healing the damage I was doing. 2 of my 3 losses were from those Pokemon, where I don't think I really had a chance of winning. Looking back on it, Pelipper with its Flying Stab would have been the better choice over Politoed. My other loss was from a Charizard Y Tailwind Hyper Offense team, where I did get outplayed on a few turns, but I also got pretty frustrated because I was about to win Game 2 when my opponent got a double Protect, meaning that both their Pokemon got a double Protect, which caused them to win the game. But of course, I don't think that really changed too much, as there was still a Game 3 to be played, and I probably would have lost later on in the tournament anyways. Okay, that was my run, but let's look at other people's. Here are the standings for the Grand Champions Festival. I'm going to be looking at the top 8 teams in this tournament, starting off with number 8. So, looking at this here, it's a Trick Room team, but it also has an offensive side. It's kind of like half and half. I'm not sure you'd bring Charizard and Kangaskhan. You can make use of normal Kangaskhan, but I think most of the time it's going to be the Trick Room mode. And this is a pretty good team because Kangaskhan with Scrappy, if you lead Fergaraf and Kangaskhan, you're kind of guaranteed to get Trick Room up because you can fake out with Scrappy Kangaskhan into Ghost types. That might have been like your opponent's Trick Room counter, such as like Sinistra, if it was going to try and use Trick Room. And you kind of guarantee that you set it up. I think also Hammer Arm is really cool on Kangaskhan. With Parental Bond, if you do Mega Evolve, you actually half your speed with 1 Hammer Arm, which I think is pretty interesting. And then, of course, you have the Torkoal for big spread damage, along with Primarina for other big spread damage. I'd say Primarina kind of has anti-synergy with Torkoal and Charizard Y, but I mean, this team got 8th, so it was probably due to like good positioning and the person's experience with the team. And then of course you have the Sneasler with U-Turn, which is interesting. Probably too easier setup Trick Room. You can U-Turn into one of your sweepers, which I think that's pretty interesting. Moving on to number 7. This looks like a rain team here with Mega Venusaur. This looks like a pretty bulky team, but the Sableye doesn't have screens. It's Encore and Disable, which that's interesting, right? I would think that a team like this would have screens, maybe at least light screen probably, but it doesn't. But I think the whole thing here is probably like you have Rain Dance with Sableye because all the other weather setters are megas, which means they can mega evolve and set up the weather. So you can't really switch in Pelipper, but if you have Sableye on the field, you can use Rain Dance to kind of guarantee that you have the rain set up. You have your Mega Venusaur with a very offensive set. There isn't like Leech Seed stall, which, you know what, I'm happy. I don't like Leech Seed anymore, but I think that's kind of interesting here. Pretty standard Arcaludon, and it's actually the Choice Scarf Basculegion with adaptability instead of the Swift Swim Mystic Water Basculegion. And I think this is used to get more oomph out of your Last Respects. I know in my team, Last Respects was kind of underwhelming sometimes because I didn't have the adaptability boost, but like, you don't need to run Swift Swim because with Choice Scarf you're already outspeeding most of the field. And then Pelipper, it has this Wide Guard instead of Protect with a Citrus Berry as well. And then Kingambit actually doesn't have Kowtow Cleave, it's running Low Kick and Iron Head. Probably to, I mean, you can hit Floette for super effective, Kingambit for super effective, and Basculegion with Sucker Punch. So that's pretty interesting. Moving on to number 6, MDB here. And it looks like he was running sort of a Fantasy Core, but I'd call it more of like Mega Gengar, Alolan Ninetales duo. You have the Shadow Tag, Disable on Gengar and Encore on Alolan Ninetales. No Aurora Veil, but it's definitely more of an offensive Alolan Ninetales, especially because Freeze Dry, you can hit those water types like Palafin, Pelipper, and Rotom Wash, which I think is pretty interesting. And then you have the Choice Scarf Garchomp with Rock Tomb, which is pretty interesting. I think something you could do, you could Rock Tomb and Aerodactyl and then Blizzard to pick up the KO if it had Focus Sash. Or you could go on Charizards and avoid like a Wide Guard. And then you also have the Aegislash with Colbur Berry, which I think is also an interesting pick. Probably, like, say you're in Blade form and you can get this knockout on this Kingambit. You don't want a King's Shield because then it could Kowtow Cleave and get an attack boost. So you probably want to survive either Sucker Punch or Kowtow Cleave and just knock it out with Sacred Sword. And then you have the Shuka Berry Incineroar, probably, like, I mean, you won't take as much from ground-type moves if you accidentally Earthquake. And I think that kind of covers everything. Rotom Wash is also very good utility on this team. Yeah. Moving on to number 5. I have a theory. I think that this is Wolf. And he went into this tournament undercover with the Scovillain team. But, you know, I could be wrong. But anyways, you have the Scovillain, obviously. I think it's cool that Scovillain placed this high. Even if I hate it, I like seeing a lot of out-there Pokemon do well. And so, you have the Mega Aerodactyl if you don't want to use Scovillain, but I think you can probably use normal Aerodactyl just as much as Mega Aerodactyl. Normal Aerodactyl has a nerve, which is good, and I feel like you'd only really use Mega Aerodactyl in the Aerodactyl Mirror, or if you're trying to pick up something like a Sinister Venusaur with a Dual Wing Beat. Como-O, really good right now. With sound moves, you're soundproof, you're immune to sound moves like Perish Song or Hyper Voice from Sylveon or Mega Gardevoir. Not that you could hit them back, but it is still an option. with Clanging Scales, Clanging Soul, you can set up yourself pretty easily. You can also, instead of the Sinistra, it's the Sco Villain keeping you safe. And then you have the SBK core, I'm calling it that now. The Sneasler, Basculegion, and Kingambit core, which is pretty standard here, I think. Okay, moving on to number 4, we have Super Santi, and it looks like it's another Gengar, Alolan Ninetales balance team. We have that Fantasy Core, the Semi-Fantasy Core with Kingambit, Ninetales, and Dragonite here. And then this Alolan Ninetales actually has Encore and Disable. The Gengar has Perish Song instead of one of those. I think it only gets Disable though, but I think that's pretty interesting. You have a lot easier time setting up Perish Song, I think, if you have Disable or Encore. If you only add Encore, I mean, you might just be, like, trapping your Pokemon and making them get hit by another super effective move. But if you disable it, then it's a lot easier to get off a Perish Song, and then you can just do a pretty easy Perish Trap with that. It's the Never Melt Ice as well, so it's only boosting Blizzard, but I still think that's a pretty good, I mean, I wouldn't really know what other item you need. You already have Focus Sash on Sneasler, so, I guess the only other thing would be like a Resist Berry, but that Blizzard damage is definitely going to be doing a lot more than Never Melt Ice. And again, we see the Dragon Fang, Dragon Claw, Dragonite. That's a lot of dragons, jeez. But anyways, Dragon Claw is actually going to be doing respectable damage with the Dragon Claw, which is nice. Standard Kingambit, and pretty standard Sneasler as well. And standard Incineroar. So it is kind of just like a normal Gengar, Alolan Ninetales balance team, but with Perish Trap. I think that's pretty cool. Perish Trap is a really hard strategy to pull off. Number 3, looks like we have another Fantasy Core here with the Floette, Garchomp, and Aegislash. And it's the offensive Floette set, normal Aegislash, physical set. But it actually has Iron Head over Sacred Sword, which is kind of interesting. That way you're able to hit opposing Floette and probably knock him out. I think that, yeah, that's definitely a one-hit KO. And then we have Garchomp with White Orb and Swords Dance, so that's actually making it really hard to minimize the damage. You can't really intimidate it down, because with White Orb it'll just negate that boost, and then with Swords Dance your Earthquakes and Dragon Claws are going to be hitting insanely hard. You have the Wash Rotom to pair next to it, as well as the Aerodactyl. And then this Incineroar is cool because it has Charcoal. I think this is like the first Incineroar I've seen that runs Charcoal, and I think that's pretty cool because, like, there's a lot of Pokemon that are able to take a Flare Blitz from Incineroar, even though I'm pretty sure Incineroar was, like, made to be this offensive Pokemon. A lot of Pokemon, like, for example, with Charcoal, now you can one-shot things like Kingambit, Mega Frostlass, Sinistra, and probably Aegislash as well. And that's like really important. Those are important knockouts you want to get that you previously couldn't if you weren't holding Charcoal. So I think that's a really neat tech on Incineroar. But overall this team is, again, really standard. You're seeing a lot of that balance, especially the Fantasy Core. Now number 2. I was not expecting Mega Frostlass to place as high as it did. I thought Mega Frostlass was kind of a fraud, and that's because it's definitely the weakest out of all the weather setters. Snow is probably the least impactful, but this player really made it work. I mean, You have the SBK core. Yep, the SBK core, it's official. I mean, they're all pretty standard sets. Focus Sash is not something you see every day, and I remember watching this and like in the finals, and they set up Aurora Veil, but they also had Focus Sash Basculegion, and I was like kind of confused of why they would set up Aurora Veil if the Focus Sash was just going to let them survive anyways. But I don't think that usually they pair Basculegion and Frostlass. I think so for the bulky Pokemon on the team, like Dragonite, Milotic, and Kingambit, they're all very bulky Pokemon that benefit from the extra bulk that Aurora Veil gives. The Milotic has Life Dew, so it can heal up, and then Dragonite has Multiscale, which means you're basically always going to be surviving a hit, even if it's like another Blizzard from, like a Blizzard with Multiscale and Aurora Veil, you're still going to be surviving that. And you're going to be able to set up Tailwind or get a huge Dragon Claw off because of that Dragon Fang giving Dragon Claw an extra boost. And then the Kingambit being able to take a fighting type move due to Chople Berry, pretty standard. But it's just an overall bulky Pokemon that can do consistent damage with Kowtow Cleave and Sucker Punch, and low kick to pick up those other Kingambits. I think it's kind of interesting how they have it on both the Dragonite and Kingambit. I guess that's just like the extra assurance, but they also have Sneasler. I don't know if something would be better for one of these, like for Dragonite, maybe you want to run Protect, but I mean, Kingambit was the most used Pokemon in the top cut, so having 3 Pokemon that can deal with it really well definitely helped this player get second, I think. And then finally we have Raj's team, Raj is also running the Fantasy Core with Floette, Garchomp, and Kingambit, as you see here. Charizard Y, standard set. The standard set for offensive Mega Floette. I'll get back to Garchomp later, but it's also the standard Chople Berry Kingambit. Standard Aerodactyl, although it does have Wide Guard instead of Dual Wing Beat, which means you can protect your Charizard from things like Rock Slide or Muddy Water, as long as other spread moves like Earthquake or Matcha Gotcha. And then of course it's the standard Choice Scarf Basculegion with adaptability. Now Garchomp I think this is a really cool Garchomp set. It's Dragon Fang Scale Shot, and I think that's really neat because with the Dragon Fang, Scale Shot is going to be doing some pretty good damage. Even if it's not hitting like 4 or 5 times, it's still going to be hitting pretty hard. And I'm pretty sure you can knock out opposing dragons like Garchomp and what's another popular dragon right now? Maybe Hydreigon. But I think it's just going to be doing some consistent damage, probably two-shotting most Pokemon in this format. And for those Steel types, you have Earthquake and Stomping Tantrum. You probably want to run Stomping Tantrum over Rock Slide just so you're able to get past that Wide Guard. But you also have Earthquake because you have Charizard and Aerodactyl to pair it with. Another cool thing about Scale Shot is you get a speed boost, and I think after a speed boost, Garchomp is like naturally outspeeding probably everything in the game. Right? You're outspeeding Choice Scarf Basculegion, Aerodactyls, probably Dragapults, and maybe the only thing that you're not outspeeding is opposing Garchomp with Choice Scarf. I don't know the nature and sets on this Garchomp, but if you're like running Jolly, you'll probably be able to outspeed those too, so I think that's pretty neat. Anyways, yeah, Raj's team is just pretty standard. I mean, you have it's Fantasy Core plus the hyper offensive Tailwind mode, which I think is probably most teams that are in the Grand Champions Festival. And I mean, even though this team is super standard, I think that just proves how good of a player Raj is. I mean, everybody knew this team was out there, everybody was planning against it, and Raj still just used this team to its full potential and won the whole tournament, which is crazy. Anyways, that is all the teams in the top 8. Congratulations to all the players that placed high in this tournament. It was not me, unfortunately. I could not feature myself in one of these teams. But I think this also gives a lot of good insight towards the meta. You're seeing a lot of balance and a lot of that fantasy core here. So, yeah. Where will the meta go next? That's what you're about to find out. So unfortunately, I don't have time for a full-fledged meta-analysis. However, I'm still just going to do an overview and some predictions in this conclusion. One prediction that I have is due to all the fantasy cores around right now, steel types are going to become a lot more common. Steel is definitely the dominant type in the fantasy core, and two steel types that I have my eye on are Corviknight and Tinkaton. Corviknight is extremely bulky and isn't affected by Intimidate, and also has Body Press to hit Kingambit and can set up Tailwind for utility. Tinkaton also is really good for utility with Fake Out and Helping Hand and Mold Breaker. It can also hit Dragon type super effectively with Play Rough. Another Pokemon that I think will get more usage is Scovillain. I think after the Grand Champions Festival, people are starting to realize, like, hey, this mon is legit. Spicy Spray is kinda busted. It also has a really good matchup into the SBK core because all of them are physical attackers. A Pokemon that I think will drop in usage is actually Sneasler. A lot of people are running their Pokemon a lot more physically bulky, and Sneasler being the #1 threat right now is sure to be the main focus when trying to build a counter meta team. I also think that Aerodactyl will get less usage. Wide Guard is definitely going to become a lot more common, and since Aerodactyl kind of relies on Rock Slide a lot, it's going to have a lot harder time doing damage. I think people are going to shift towards either bulky Tailwind setters like Corviknight, or the guaranteed Tailwind setters like Whimsicott and Talonflame. One last Pokemon that I think is going to get less usage is Mega Floette. I know it just seems like people are just starting to use it, but hear me out. Floette is a one-trick pony. Like, it only runs fairy moves, and that's kind of its shtick. Hit hard with fairy moves. And it isn't as game-breaking as Xerneas was, and I think a lot of players are going to start putting multiple counters on their teams for it. One last prediction I have is that Gengar and Snow teams are going to be on the rise. Mega Gengar is a really complex Pokemon to use, but the reward is really good, and I think as the rule set goes on, people will find the best way to use it, and it's definitely going to become a lot better when you have experience with it. Snow is also really good right now because you can kind of fit it anywhere on your team, and balance is everywhere. And the fact that it got second in the Grand Champions Festival, even in such a hostile environment with sun and sand teams everywhere, just shows that it is a strong option. Anyways, that is my meta-analysis. Hopefully you enjoyed my breakdown and experience of the largest Pokemon tournament of all time. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. And in the meantime, I'm going to work on improving my Champions play and innovating, so when the next big tournament rolls around, I'll be ready. And of course, thanks for watching.